Okay, authority. That's because for me, the Bible has authority. Again, some of you might be in a different place on that. But if you are, at least you can listen and hear how Christians approach this topic. And because sometimes there's misunderstanding about how Christians approach this topic. So authority is how we started trying to figure out how we can be faithful interpreters. Now, for that, we have to figure out how authority works. Christian belief has traditionally understood the idea that God had purposes, communicative purposes, and that God carried out those purposes through human intermediaries, through human instruments. We call them the biblical authors. And so God chose to use that process to communicate with us. And so the human purposes of those people who were writing and speaking, they are reflecting God's purpose. And so in that sense, the authority of God is vested in those instruments. That means if we want to understand what God has to say, we need to understand what those human authors are saying. That's how he chose to work. In that sense, we have an accountability to the human instruments who have produced our Bibles. And that accountability is important because if we're going to understand biblical truth, we have to understand it in light of what they were intending to communicate. And if we're going to understand what claims the Bible makes in any area, whether it's human origins, as we're talking about here, or if you're talking about any of the social issues today, we have to understand what claims the biblical text is actually making, because sometimes there's misunderstanding about that. And that's what we're going to be exploring today. We're not going to be looking at the science. You're going to have other lectures to do that as this series moves on. But we're going to be looking at the biblical text and what claims it makes. Now, once we understand that the text is working by means of these human instruments, we understand that even though the Bible is written for us, it is not written to us. It's not in our language. That's why you need translators. And if it's not in our language, it's not in our culture, because language and culture are inseparable. So the Bible is written for us, but it's not written to us. We believe its message is for everyone, but we have to do some work to get to it. God could have communicated it fresh, once a century to every language and every culture. God could have done it however he wanted, but he didn't. And we have to work with how he did do it. So if we're going to get to that authoritative message, if we're going to understand the claims of the text, we can't understand them against our world because it was not written to our world. We're reading someone else's mail. Instead, we have to try to get to their world.